ever told you about the time I almost got into a bar fight in France? You thought you knew me pretty well, huh? Well, when I was 20 years old, I spent a semester studying in the south of France, which is totally the thing to do if you are a French major and really want to learn the language and the culture. And you do this, not by staying in your room all night studying verb charts, but by going out to where the people are, and that would be the bars. So that's how I found myself at a French watering hole one Friday night, chatting with some young locals who were remarkably forgiving about my accent and occasional tiny grammatical error. But not everyone was charmed by my American accent. Out of the blue, a young French woman standing near me cried out, "Attention!" and shoved me hard to the side. Confused and off balance, I looked at her expecting another attack, but she was actually pointing to someone behind me, screaming that he had tried to light my hair on fire. Enraged, I spun around to face my real attacker, a wizened old man with slumped shoulders and a strange grin on his unshaven face. He was still flicking a lighter in the direction of my waist-length hair and muttering. He'd probably been drinking the better part of the day, and between the heavy slurring and the missing teeth, I couldn't understand his words, but the French student standing nearby summarized his rant. He was angry about how the Americans had engaged in World War II 50-some years prior, and he hated us all. As I considered the tragedy of that broken old man who held half a century of hatred toward an entire nation of strangers, I was moved from rage to compassion. He may have deserved to be smacked upside the head, but I wasn't going to do that. What he needed was a hug. I wasn't going to do that either. Instead, I moved to a safe distance from his lighter and tried to forget about the incident, but I haven't forgotten. I think about him from time to time, the man I didn't talk to in the bar. I wonder what might have happened if instead of trying to set me on fire, he had bought me a drink. I wonder if he still would have hated me if we had talked. I think it might have been interesting for us to talk about World War II. He certainly had his opinions about it, and I would have enjoyed hearing them, as my own grandpa, who had recently died at that time, was a decorated World War II veteran. Maybe we could have shared stories and seen each other not as enemies, but as fellow humans. This memory surfaced for me as I was reflecting on Jesus' teaching from the 6th chapter of Luke, part of a longer sermon on how one is to treat other humans. Jesus said, "Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Abba, God, is merciful." Well, that's a hard teaching. Jesus is insisting that we take the moral high ground and be like God, who is kind even to the ungrateful and the wicked, and merciful even to the undeserving. Now, I'm glad I didn't smack that old guy upside the head after he tried to light my hair on fire, and maybe that was merciful, but I have to admit I wasn't exactly kind to him. Instead, I gave him a withering look, and I may have even tried out one of the fun new French words I learned, the kind of word they don't print in the textbooks. But kindness is a core value of Jesus' faith tradition. The Hebrew word for kindness, hesed, appears 250 times in the Hebrew Bible. There's just no getting around it. Kindness matters to God, and as God's children, kindness needs to matter to us too. And it does, really. We love being kind. You know how great it feels to help someone. A couple weeks ago, we heard from some people who had fallen upon hard times, and they were in need of food and gas. So we took up a little collection in church, and while some of us were trying to figure out the most practical way to get the resources to these folks, our most senior member, 90 years young, just went on out, found the people, and had them follow him to the gas station where he filled their tank. Done. I called him up that afternoon to thank him for his great act of discipleship, and he told me, I was just so happy to be able to help. This is consistent with the research. Psychologists have the data to prove that when we do something kind for someone else, our brains light up even more than when someone does something kind for us. We are hardwired to practice kindness. And just as Jesus said, the reward is great. Dr. Michelle Robin, founder of the 31-Day Kindness Campaign, says that nearly all the research shows that people practicing kindness tend to be happier, have less stress, better relationships, greater success in business, happier marriages, and longer lives. Pretty great rewards indeed. It's just that when we perceive someone to be a threat, our impulse for self-preservation takes over. We go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, a useful instinct that keeps us alive, right? Not a great idea to get too close to someone brandishing a weapon, even a cigarette lighter, which is why I got away from that guy in the bar as quickly as I could. I was no way giving him a second chance with my well-being. But even if no one has ever tried to set you on fire, it's possible that someone has gotten you fired up with their words. Maybe even recently, as we are deep into election season and the race is tight. With narrow margins, each side is deeply committed to framing the other side as your biggest enemy of all time. This message is pushed through television, internet, email, snail mail, text message, and good old-fashioned signs all over the land. With so much propaganda, it is tempting to see the other side as enemies, right? And against our better judgment, we buy into it. It's easy to fall into the trap of vilifying the other side. After all, we know the difference between right and wrong, and when someone does not share our beliefs, doesn't that mean they are wrong? And if our position is based upon our moral framework, then clearly those on the other side must be not only wrong, but amoral. We imagine them as the worst of the worst, and we assume the worst. They'd probably light our hair on fire if they could, right? But we're not going to give them the chance. We'll never sit down with them or even stand too close because we do not trust them. If we believe certain people to be untrustworthy, amoral, or even dangerous, it becomes difficult to be kind to them. We instinctively know to stay away from animals that bite, and we keep a safe distance from someone walking down the street wearing a campaign slogan that sends the same signal of fear to our amygdala, which, by the way, is a fantastic argument against wearing campaign slogans on our clothing. They never ever convince the other side to see things our way, but they do reinforce the idea that we are in the enemy camp. And that stops kindness in its tracks. Even so, we long for kindness. A poll released in September of 2022 found that 75% of Americans surveyed from all political affiliations agreed with the statement that to restore peace and unity, we need leaders to model kindness and understanding for people with whom they disagree. The problem is our leaders cannot be counted on to model this for us. We, the people of faith at the very least, must begin to model it ourselves. As the old song goes, let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me. Begin with me, peace on earth, how on earth? Love your enemies, do good. Did Jesus understand how hard it would be? Clearly, he never sat at the Thanksgiving table mere weeks after a national election. In fact, Jesus' people didn't have elections, so obviously he had no idea how emotionally challenging it is to see those signs going up in the yards of people you would like to call friends. It'd be easier to love our enemies if they weren't so blatant about their wrong-headedness, right? Well, I would like to introduce you to a concept from a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. He came up with the idea that there are 6 moral foundations that we can stand upon when discerning what is the moral answer to a difficult question, which means that there are 6 different ways for a moral person to think, which means that there can be multiple answers to any question, and get this, the different answers can all be moral. For example, someone who supports a total ban on abortion probably feels very strongly about the sanctity of an unborn child's life, and that is a moral argument. but another person might support access to abortion as a way of ensuring care for women experiencing complicated pregnancies. That is also a moral stance. Both positions are moral, so either position is possible for a moral person depending on their particular framework and life experiences. Now, as moral people with our own life experiences, we might be able to see both sides, but we probably agree more with one than with the other. So how could we even be in conversation with someone whose stance differs from our own? First, we would let them share what they believe and why, and rather than argue our position, we would listen deeply, the way Jesus listened to people. And then we might say something like, I see that the sanctity of an unborn child's life is very important to you, or I see that care for women's well-being is very important to you. That kind of statement validates the moral foundation from which someone is operating. They feel seen and heard, and that builds trust and empathy. At this point, we could ask, may I share how I feel? And if the other person is even interested, then we can name the value that leads us to our own conclusion, keeping it simple. The point isn't to engage or win an argument or try to change someone's mind. The point is only to recognize our commonality as moral people. And we do have a great deal of common ground. As human beings, over 99% of our DNA is the same from person to person. Our differences come from less than 1% of our genetic makeup. Rather than despise that 1% of difference, maybe we could become curious about it. Isn't it fascinating that people look, learn, love, live, and think differently from each other? Why is that? We'll only know when we show up with curiosity. Different ideas do not need to be terrifying. We might even be able to learn a thing or two from each other. I saw that happen just a tiny bit at last week's vice presidential debate. In spite of much arguing over divisive topics, there was some acknowledgement of common ground, a shadow of agreement on some things. It was not much and it was not perfect, but it was a start. It made me wonder what might happen if both parties could take the brushes with which they have been painted and begin to swirl the colors together. Consider, for instance, the meaning of the words conservative and liberal. Now, conservative means protecting and cherishing what is good from the past. Think of a conservatory of music. It also means conserving resources so they don't run out. Think conserving energy. All of this is great. Now, as for liberal, this word conveys a sense of generosity. Think of spreading the butter liberally on your toast. It also means being open of spirit or open-minded, like a liberal studies education that teaches a broad variety of subjects. That's also great. Both liberal and conservative ideas are helpful and necessary. So you might ask, am I a liberal or conservative? Absolutely. Let's take the best of both, shall we? As any kid holding a paintbrush understands, to pick just one of two colors, red or blue, is frustratingly limiting. If you let a young artist choose, they may start with one or the other, but pretty soon they'll start playing with how many ways they can combine them. Blue here, red there, layers upon layers of those two primary colors until the most beautiful shades of purple emerge, my favorite color. What could we learn from children in this regard? Jesus said that to children belong the kingdom of God. Well, then let us figure out how many shades of purple we can make. Purple, the color of harmony and collaboration. Over the next 4 weeks, we are going to be inundated with messages from various campaigns. Some will resonate with us, others not so much. But no matter how we plan to cast our vote, let us all support Jesus' campaign for kindness.